us up in prayer, and then we're going to just go ahead and let Tara get started here, and I will introduce her as well. So let's go to the Lord in prayer first. Lord, we want to thank you for this technology that allows us to come together, that allows us to hear from Tara today. Pray that you would open our minds and hearts, that we would receive what you have planned for us to hear. Pray that you would give us something that we can take back to our congregations that will help us with our ministry for Safe Church. So Lord, we thank you for everyone here today. Pray that everything would work in terms of the technology and that this would be a blessing for those who attend. Lord, we ask this in the precious name of Jesus, our Savior and Lord, and for the glory of your kingdom, Lord. Amen. All right, so if you don't know how to turn your video on, it's right at the bottom of your screen. There's a little thing that looks like a microphone and a little thing that looks like a video camera. And if the video camera has a red line through it, click on that so we can see you. That'd be great. And we're really privileged today to have Tara Boer with us, and she just left her screen, but I'm sure she'll be back and you'll get to see her. So I'm just gonna go ahead and introduce her anyway. We're very happy to have her. I feel like I know Tara a little bit because we were supposed to have a training out in Iowa, Sioux Center, Iowa, where she lives. And that was going to happen in January, and there was a huge blizzard. So I actually got snowed in there for a few days, but we didn't get to have the training, and I never actually got to meet Tara. And then that got rescheduled to April. And so then COVID came, and so we again had to cancel that. So someday I will hope to meet Tara in person, but I'm really glad that we have her today. She teaches in the social work department at Dordt University. She's also worked as a therapist in residential settings for delinquent teens. She's worked in a sexual abuse center and also in the welfare system with families. So she has a lot of good experience that we can learn from. She also has 3 children at home now, 2 girls and 1 boy, and a husband. So that's always good too. So we're just very thankful to have Tara with us today. So let's clap. It's hard to clap on Zoom.
Oh, thank you. Thank you.
And Tara, also I forgot to say that she is currently serving as a Safe Church coordinator for classes Iacota and Heartland. So those 2 classes have 1 coordinator. So Tara, we'll give this to you now. Thanks for coming.
Oh, thanks for that introduction. I had to step away because, like I said, my colleague is moving in. She's literally like hammering pictures into the wall. So I was like, maybe we could just take a break from the hammering right now. So hopefully that's not too much of a distraction. Thank you. I'm just really thankful to be here. I grew up here in small town, Northwest Iowa, and was educated here and went to Dordt. And so I know what it's like to grow up like many of you who reside in rural communities or in small towns, knowing that I wanted to pursue social work, a profession of helping people, and wondering who I was actually going to end up serving. Because in my eyes, when I was younger at least, I thought that everybody had it together, that there weren't problems here, or that those things just didn't happen here. And I remember going out into the field as a new graduate, thinking I'm going to save the world, and then realizing that so many of these problems that I had learned about in school were literally affecting my neighbors, and my literal neighbors. Like some of them were just down the street that I would, wave to. And so I think at that point, my heart was very much softened to just the idea that hard things happen here, and they happen everywhere, because if they happen here, they happen everywhere. And so that's my hope too, that we don't rest in this place of being just content with our perceptions of how safe we are, or how safe our children maybe are, without being too alarming that we can't learn to just, be in community with people, to trust people to some degree. So I always think there's this sweet spot where we're trying really hard to balance how do we give good care to people and build trusting, connected relationships with people while still remaining vigilant about how to to care for especially our most vulnerable people. So they asked me to talk a little bit about the ACE study, and some of you may have heard about this study. It's used as kind of a foundation of knowledge, especially for organizations or ministries that are really trying to move towards what we call trauma-informed care. And so you might hear that word a few times throughout this webinar. Is just this idea of seeing people through this lens of what happened here, this great curiosity about what might be wrong. Oftentimes we're presented with problems in our ministries, and all we see is like the behaviors, right? We see sometimes very maladaptive and unhealthy behaviors. We see legal problems, abuse, all of this stuff. And it's natural to try to make judgments about where those behaviors come from, and maybe even cast, just set them aside and maybe discount their experience. But I have learned, really been humbled by people's stories, and that everybody has a story, as many of you know. And when we position ourselves to just be curious about where people may have been, or how maybe they've been harmed that have led them to either make the decisions that they're making or behave in the way that we're behaving, I think that we're in better positions to serve them. And so I often tell my students, knowing this doesn't excuse behavior. I think God calls us to high accountability, especially when we're talking about offenders and things like that. But it sure explains it, and I think when we're able to maybe understand where things might be coming from, we have better empathy, and we ask better questions, and we come alongside in much more healthy ways. So I'm gonna, they asked me to talk for about 15, I think originally she told me 15, and I was like, I need more time than that. So I'll try really hard to move through this ACE study, and I'd like for you to, just be willing to ask questions. If there's gonna be time for questions at the end. So if there's things that stand out to you, or just questions you have, I'm happy to answer those. So I'm gonna share my screen here. Practice my teaching, because I have to start teaching here pretty soon. So can you see
I'm
it?
going to break in 1 second,
Yeah.
Tara. I think we want people, if you have questions, you can use the chat feature to post questions, and then we'll also be able to do that at the end. But go ahead and write questions in that chat box, okay?
Great.
Thanks.
Yeah, thank you. So we're just going to talk about trauma. I think trauma gets a lot of attention right now. I was just on a conference call, we were talking about PTSD, and I think even that gets thrown around really quickly about what is PTSD. People often think of veterans quickly, and certainly there's a lot of veterans that are affected by post-traumatic stress. But I think in my work with children and families, I've learned that, a lot of us have been traumatized in different ways. In fact, many of us will not be able to go through life without having some type of experience that is particularly invasive and life moving. The difference is that sometimes people are able to walk away from those experiences and be unaffected per se by them. They continue to go to work, go to school, they sleep okay, they eat okay. Their relationships may be largely unaffected. But depending on the trauma, some people walk away and they are very much changed by it. They have intrusive thoughts, they have intrusive memories, they avoid people and places and those types of things. And one thing I like to say about trauma is that it's really in the eye of the beholder, right? So like if, I always give this example, but if Bonnie and I are in a car accident together and we experience the same experience, so to speak, she and I might walk away from that experience and have very different takeaways from that. I might say, oh, wow, that was quite scary, but it looked like you had control the whole time. I saw the ditch. We were going to take the ditch and it was fine. Bonnie walks away as also a passenger. We won't say she's driving. I'm sure Bonnie's a really good driver. And she goes, oh my goodness, we almost died. I saw that semi coming. I could smell our tires, burning. And she walks away and goes home and she has interrupted sleep. She can't get into her car the next day. you know, all those types of things. So it's important to remember that when we think about these experiences that people are harmed by, that it's largely their perception of the experience and how they integrate those experiences into their memory and the meaning they place behind it. Okay, so I say that because I was a child whose parents were divorced. And I would say I was fairly resilient through my connections. I was pretty connected to my community, you know, that way. But there's kids that I have counseled that are just really traumatized by that particular life situation, and it really sets them off course for a long time. And so everybody is different. So let's talk a little bit about the ACE study here. I'm going to move my screen down so I can see. So this study was done in the early 90s by Dr. Robert Anda and Dr. Vincent Folletti. It was a partnership from the CDC, whom we hear a lot about right now, and the Kaiser Permanente Foundation. It's basically like a health insurance company. And it's one of the largest studies of its kind in that it took data from over 17,000 participants, which is, if you know anything about research, it's just an incredible sample size. And what they did is they gave, I'm going to show you the questions on the ACE study here in a little bit. And they gave them 10 questions and they said, did these things happen to you prior to the age of 18? And people had to answer either yes or no to these 10 questions. And that's what is your ACE score. So I'm going to have you all identify your ACE score so you can kind of see how you land in this large study here. 17,000 participants, that's a lot of people. And so what they did is they continued to follow these participants and they start to understand this high correlation between high ACE scores and things like physical health problems, behavioral health problems, psychological problems, all of those things. And so everybody's kind of like, well, duh, hard things impact people. But I think this is the first time where it was like this scientific measure where we're like, you know what, when children have adversity, that they're negatively impacted later in life to pretty significant degrees. Their marriages are negatively impacted, their choices about substances and all finances, all those things. They actually said they have a 20 year less lifespan. And so there's just a lot of things that are affected by early childhood. So I had told you I want you to see the contents of that survey. And so just a forewarning for those of you that have, you know, experienced childhood adversity, there's some, you know, questions on here that could be fairly triggering for you. So because they're divided into abuse, neglect, and household challenges are the questions. So we're going to move forward here. There are 10 questions. And if you answer yes to any of the questions, then that means you get 1 point, I guess you could say. So I'm going to give you a minute to read through these questions and then you can get your score. There's one more screen because there's 10 total questions. Okay, we'll move to the next screen. And here's the next 5. Okay, so I think it's pretty important to have our ACE score, I think, especially when we're looking at research, because we can kind of think about where we land with the larger population. I'll show you that Iowa actually mimicked this study too. So what you have in your head right now is your ACE score, and this is the outcomes of the 17,000 participants. And they broke them down in different ways. So 33% of the population has 0 ACEs. And then you can see how it goes up to 26%, 16% have 2, 10% have 3, 16% have 4. And what they found is that ACEs often occur in clusters. Because if you have to say yes to one of those questions, you're probably very likely have to say yes to another one. For example, if you know, you had someone in your family was arrested, you probably also experienced domestic violence or saw someone in your home be hit or harmed, or maybe there was physical or sexual abuse. So they found that cluster kind of phenomenon happened here. And so you can see where you are and all of that. Sometimes I'll ask my students to tell me how they're feeling after filling that out. And there's just a really broad range of feelings that come from that. Some of them are just very, some of them feel very blessed because they could say 0. And some of them say sad all over again, or just, my heart is racing. I'm sad all over again, thinking about those things. And so, these are hard topics for people to have to kind of bring up. So they also, like I said, distributed that data into 3 different categories. So here's household dysfunction, neglect and abuse, because there's physical neglect and emotional, psychological neglect. So you can see the percentages of those 17,000 participants of what they said that they experienced. So 27, almost 31 out of 3, almost people said they had some form of substance abuse in their childhood home, mental illness, battered mothers. And you'll see that, anytime we fill out a survey, there is some subjectivity in what we have to name it, right? So like, if you think that your mom had, depression, but she never went and got service for it, you might still answer yes to mental illness, right? Even though it was never maybe diagnosed, or maybe she never took medication or sought services for it. So there is some subjectivity in filling out the survey, but we see that the physical abuse and sexual abuse, especially sexual abuse, aligns pretty closely to what we say, girls and boys, how often that they're abused by the time that they're 18. We usually say 1 out of 4, 1 out of 5. So that's pretty close there. What the data that we kind of work with when we talk about how often these things actually happen. And I will say, having worked in a small town, I remember being very, very saddened by how often people were sexually abused, both as, coming out as children, or adults who have told me that, that happened to them when they were children and they just never sought care for it, or that they had never told anybody about it. Iowa also did their own study. They called it the Iowa ACE 360. They completed this in 2015, so it's a little bit more recent. A lot of the data is pretty comparable, but if you're viewing this from Iowa, you can kind of see some of those numbers as well. Yeah, some of them are pretty comparable, but some of them are different. I noticed the sexual abuse is a little bit lower, 9.7%. So there was nothing really in it for them. They didn't have to disclose who their abuser was, or go seek treatment or anything like that. It was just kind of a survey. So if you're interested in that data, I have that posted on that resource page that I share at the end of this presentation too. So what they found was that the higher your ACE score, the higher, number of health problems you had, both physical health and psychological, emotional health. And so they call that a dose-response relationship. The higher the ACE score, the more likely you are to struggle with depression, anxiety, substance abuse, marry someone who's a batterer or a user. And so we can just assume that if people are coming to us with these problems, right, that they've probably had to say yes to some of those questions. And they may or may not, probably likely not, have received care for those problems. And so that's kind of what we're dealing with in ministry, is kind of the underlying stuff that may or may not have been worked through. So we can't really talk about trauma without talking about the brain, or at least in my world, you can't, because first of all, I think talking about how trauma impacts the body takes away some of the stigma about why we're experiencing, why Bonnie is waking up in the middle of the night, or why she's having a hard time getting back in that car. If we understand how the brain works, we can empathize, and really we can say, you know what, something's not working right in my brain. And I think in this culture sometimes where we reside, where it says, you know what, figure it out, get over it, kind of thing. We all heard that as a kid. I probably did it to my kid the other day when he scratched his knee. You're all right, buddy. All right. Right. I doubt he was traumatized by it, but we do that quickly. We say, get, you're all right. But the back part of the brain, that's back here, is responsible for this fight or flight response. So that's like your limbic system connected to your brain stem. And that's the most, original primitive form of our brain. I have a 5-month-old at home, and she knows how to cry. She knows how to get her needs met, and she knows how to, to eat, sleep, all the basics. And she knows when she's scared, and that's about it. So that's what we have when we're very young. You'll notice this in young children. They can't regulate. Big events are very hard to handle, or, hearing no or disappointment is very hard. And that's because this upstairs brain right here is not fully developed until we're about 25 years old. And so I even tell my college kids this, and they're like, oh man, I'm still not that smart. I just said, well, there's a reason that rental car companies don't let anybody just, I think you have to be 25 for rental car companies, but they know that research. They know that upstairs brain isn't really developed. So this is where we do all of our good choices, where we regulate, where we use language, where we name. The other day, my daughter got mad at me and she goes, oh, if I could hit you, I would. And she just kind of looked at me. She was so mad, but she's almost 7 now. And she know that frontal lobe is going, I can't hit you. I know that would be a problem if I hit my mom, whereas my 4-year-old, he'll let her fly, if he's mad, because that frontal lobe is really not as developed as his. So this book, The Whole Brain Child, for any of you working with children, I'd highly encourage you to read that book, whether you're a parent or care for children in any way. It's really good at explaining that. So, did I go back maybe? Why am I going backwards? There we go. Okay, so this is a little bit more too, for those of you that like a little science. This is a Spec Scan, kind of just showing the difference of how brains really work. So you can see the back of the brain. I don't know why I can't get my cursor to go, but the back of the brain on that left side graph there this is a healthy brain. So this is a 3-year-old boy who has had, lots of interactions and lots of play, has been safe, feeling safe at home. So he's got a lot of activity going on back here. But he's also got a lot of activity going on up here in his frontal lobe. So there's a lot of blood flow, a lot of, connections going on there. And that means he feels safe and that he can learn, right? But this one right here, we call this, an abused brain. I think it's a boy that was in an orphanage and was very severely neglected. And you can see how this back part of the brain, again, has a lot of blood flow, but this front part, this frontal lobe, is very minimally used, and that's because he's largely responsible for survival. This is when we see kids move from foster care, out of maybe unhealthy homes into maybe safe foster families, and all of a sudden we see this language explosion, or we have this huge growth in relationships and all that, right? Because once they feel safe, that fight or flight can rest, and then that frontal lobe can go, okay, now I'm going to use my words, and I'm going to think about a problem, and I'm going to try to calm myself, right? I'll tell you a little bit more about that when this synaptic density. So I didn't like biology, guys. When I took class at Dordt, I was so thankful I had one biology class. But now that I know so much about, or not so much, but that I love really neurobiology, I love learning about, how this works. And so this is our neural networks. We have billions of neural networks at birth already, and this is just a small picture of that. And again, that's wired for survival. And at elementary age, kids are asking a lot of questions. They're wondering. You'll hear that a lot from your 6 to 12-year-olds, wondering how that works or why that happens. And they're trying relationships, and they're sensitive to rejection, and they're wondering what foods they like, and their sleeping patterns are kind of being established, right? And then at puberty, they have this, what we call this pruning stage. And that's when puberty, again, to about 25, we start to lose networks that we don't use a lot. And that's kind of when they prune away. So if manipulation works for teens, they're going to use it because it works, right? We have high rewards by making people do what we want them to do. We're going to keep manipulating people because that highway gets traveled a lot. I think in my next slide, it's called Hebb's axiom. It was Donald Hebb. He was a psychiatrist back in, I believe in the 1850s, but he said neurons that fire together wire together. So anytime we have an activity where, we have a strong emotion associated with an activity, there's kind of this think of about a road starts. And the more often that we engage in that activity and that emotion, and they're connected, it becomes this very well-traveled road. We're used to using it. So think about, I was just thinking about this in my daughter's relationship with food right now, because she's 6 months old. She wakes up in the middle of the night. She's not hungry. She's got enough meat on her. I know that she's not hungry, but she's used to eating. And then I put her back down because I want to go to bed, right? But now she wakes up and she's associated food with sleep, or just being fed with sleep, right? And now she's kind of got this neural pathway that said, I need mom, and I need food, and then I need sleep, right? And so it actually makes me think about how we largely have a problem with depending on food for comfort, right? And you think about how we treat babies, we always just feed them, here's some food, right? So we won't get into that, but there's a lot of things I wonder about knowing that. So, and, you know, our relationship with exercise is painful at first. We don't like exercise, but after about, you know, 6-8 weeks, that's about when neural networks start to fade and prune off and start to strengthen. Then we go, you know what? I feel better, you know, when I exercise and things are going better. So that's kind of that pathway kind of thing explained in very simple terms. And that's kind of a cool thing. So when kids are engaged in this chronic stressful state, they become very fixated on survival, where they're hypervigilant. You might have kids or adults that are constantly scanning, looking around, might appear just very anxious during social settings, and you're wondering what's going on. I've met with abuse victims before where they're very aware of where the exits are. They're very aware of where they're sitting in a room and who's in the room with them, and you know what kind of power structures are present in them. And so your brain gets used to that because God made us in a way to survive. He wanted people to survive, and so that's kind of a natural God-given thing. But it can become very maladaptive if that part of the brain becomes very, very well traveled, and we're just constantly hypervigilant. Okay, and then neurons is another word that I've learned a lot about. But we all have neurons, excitatory, inhibitory. So we have ones that make us excited or feel good, and then we have ones that calm us, like GABA and things like that. So, you know, we typically have more excitable neurons where we're just kind of scanning and reacting. And those can come in all kinds of forms. So we have to teach people to use calming techniques because that's not something that their brains are used to executing. We see in studies of the brain, decreased size of the corpus callosum, which is a little sciencey, but that's just this section right here that connects the right side of the brain and the left side of the brain. And your right side of the brain needs to talk to the left side in simple terms. And so your right side is really responsible for body language and interpretation and context kind of thing. And the left side is largely responsible for language and like things that make very logical people. I always say my social workers are pretty right-brained. Like they like problem solving, they like music, and you know, all those things because it's kind of abstract. But you use both sides the same. They just need to talk to each other. And then increased activity and growth in the limbic system. We talked about that. So here's a little thing that I talked about before: neurons that fire together, wire together. So think about our families in our churches and their relationship with the church. You know, they might have strong feelings about the church because of experiences they've had in the church previously, and they have these strong emotions that are connected to this pathway of, could be rejection, and when I see this type of person leading my church, or when I see this type of activity going on in my church, they become maybe triggered by that, or their brains kind of remember. So just remember that when people become emotional, especially people that have experienced trauma, that they're very good at scanning. They will know who to trust pretty quickly, and they will be able to discern who is a safe person pretty quickly because that's how they've kind of survived. I'm going to spend a couple minutes here just talking about what you can do. Connect and redirect. Again, that right side of the brain needs to feel that you hear them. Okay, so when I tell my daughter, and she comes upstairs in the middle of the night because she's scared, and she says, "Mom, I'm scared. This doesn't happen as much anymore." But instead of saying, "Oh, there's nothing to be scared of, go back downstairs, honey," that doesn't help at all, right? But if I validate her emotion and say, "You know what, it is kind of hard being alone at night. I get it. It's dark, but it's time for bed, honey." You know, so we validate their emotion and we go back to the logic, and then that helps them integrate. My teenagers will often say, the number one thing they say about their parents is like, "They don't understand me." You know, they don't get it. And that's because a lot of times when we parent teenagers, and I have yet to do it, so I empathize with those of you that are, that they're not necessarily empathizing with the emotion. They're just telling them what they have to do. Encourage people to tell their story. Really, the power of testimony is really built into how we care for people in the church. But really, telling story creates integration because we're putting emotional experiences, which really largely are activated by the back part of our brain, and we're putting words and feelings and emotions to it. whether that's by talking or by writing. That's a very healthy activity for people to engage in. I remember after my dad passed away suddenly from an accident, I felt like this overwhelming need just to tell the story afterwards. And I would weep through the story, but I would tell it, you know, and some people maybe aren't as geared towards that, but it's an important part of healing too. Some churches are considering, you know, having a trauma-informed caregiver in their church, you know, just to have a person who knows, you know, enough about this that can reach, especially those that are impacted by it. But again, it's a lens. It's like bloodborne pathogens. When we see people, we're like, we just assume everybody's sick, you know? So it's this lens that we go, what happened? Instead of what's wrong with you, we say, what happened here, you know? Understand if someone's feeling overwhelmed, emotionally, a logical response won't likely work. We have this knee-jerk reaction to, we call this a righting reflex, where we just kind of correct people. And again, that example with my daughter and the fear of the basement, we have to connect with their emotion if we want to. Some people will come with their kids about concerns, and I often ask, do you think that this is a can't or a won't? Do you think that they have the skills to do it and they just won't do it? Or do you think that they can't, that they don't literally have the skills to carry out the activity or the relational behavior that you need them to do? So I think that's a good question to ask people, if it's can't or won't. And then lastly, establish this felt safety. And this includes, you know, people again can read well, your healthy touch, if it's appropriate for children, just, you know, a touch on the back, and you know, your soft voice getting down to their level if it's a child, the sense of what we call felt safety, again, because if their activated brain can rest, if their amygdala and their limbic system can rest, then you'll get more out of them. You'll know this if you've ever interviewed someone that's been in a trauma situation, like you're not going to get any coherent memory from them if they're still feeling threatened or scared. It's just not going to happen. Their brain won't work. I always say, this is why people forget the national anthem, right? They practice it 1,000 times and then they get in front of this group of people, they go, oh my goodness, I'm so scared, right? And then they can't remember the words, because that's your language. And that's why we can't remember people's names when we're nervous. It really all makes sense. So oh, good. I did pretty good. So here's a reference section. I was a little worried I'd go really long. The reference section, I have let me stop my share here. I have a link to a Google Doc with some of that material on it, to help you guys, you know, read through some of those things yourself, including some really good books, which I know I didn't list them all, but books that have been very formational in helping me understand these types of things, and have made me a better therapist, a better helper, but really have made me just a better person. I think just seeing people through that trauma-informed lens has really been helpful in helping me connect and gaining trust and really getting people the help that they need. So yeah, so that's my quick ACE study presentation. I see there's some chats. I haven't checked them out yet, so I'll let you facilitate that, Bonnie. Is that okay?
Yeah, I think Eric's actually going to facilitate that part about questions.
And I just put the link to the PDF in the chat as well. So thank you, Tara. I'm just, I always think it's fascinating to dive into how the brain works, and it starts to put a few more pieces of the puzzle together for me as to why I experience the things I do, why I experience other people in a certain way. And I really like what you mentioned about, like, at a first reaction, say what happened rather than like invalidating something. And that's actually one of the first questions of the restorative practices questions that a lot of schools are using. It's been used in conflict mediation. And always the first question is, what happened? And yeah, so anyway, a lot of different things that we can talk about. I guess one question that I have, and then hopefully more people can share more questions in the chat box, is just what we can do as the church, knowing somebody may have experienced different levels of trauma. How are we able to give care to different people? And actually, Professor Gibson is he teaches at Calvin Seminary, and he gave a lecture a few years ago on at a conference called To Love Your Neighbor, and he talked about trauma. And he said this. He said, "We can never talk about trauma only as an individual that is traumatized. Trauma always includes the environment that surrounds a person and how well they are able to connect with the traumatized." And so just thinking about like the brain of the kid in the orphanage and the things that they're going through in isolation compared to the experiences of a kid who has somebody to validate some of the things that they're going through and how that impacts the brain. And so I guess to bring it back to the question, how do we as the church give support or create an environment of support in different ways, especially when it's challenging to jump into some of these difficult situations?
Yeah, it's a good question. I see Pastor Gorder has a good question down there too, so I'll get to that one too. That when you were talking, the first thing that comes to my mind is shame. And I think that this is a common theme in a lot of settings that I've worked in. And this is that idea that when bad things happen to me or did happen to me, Satan loves to weigh people down with this shame of what happened, of the secret sometimes, that it entails. And so my answer to that, candidly, would be it's really about our culture, and our church needs to be fertile in that it will allow people to feel safe coming forward with some of that hurt, because those things are not easy to talk about, obviously. And I don't know what that looks like in all the churches. I know that there's a broad range of what church culture looks like, but I think if we have this culture where people aren't allowed the opportunity to be vulnerable with each other, where they're not, they don't have really, deep relationships, where they're surfacey, that kind of thing. And that can happen in different contexts. It can happen from the pulpit sharing a testimony, but it can happen in a small group, which is probably largely safer for a traumatized person. But again, there's power in telling the story, and there's power in receiving the story. And in those safe places, I think people get well, and people are willing to ask for help. Otherwise, I've always just been in awe of how many people just walk around, and myself included in the past, just carrying something that I don't need to carry that anymore. God doesn't want me to be weighed down with that anymore. And he wants his people to be a part of that community and that connection of people getting well, because it's good for the receiver and it's good for the giver. So I always say God could, snap his fingers and be done with all this mess. Like he could say, you're healed, you're better. And sometimes he does that, but he knows that this relational piece, this connection is so beautiful for the giver and receiver, and that ultimately can bring people to the Lord, really, So my initial answer would be that it has to be a safe church culture for these hard things, whether that means putting flyers out there. These things happen. We know they happen here. Again, don't making assumptions that they don't. And I remember one of my people asking, or I was doing an assessment, and I asked them a particular thing about their sexuality, and they were like, "Oh, I'm just so glad you asked, because I was so embarrassed to tell you." So just by asking the question, they told me, because they knew I wasn't ignorant to the idea that could potentially be a factor in their situation, So yeah, that's kind of my quick response to that. I don't know if that makes sense, but
yeah, creating a cultural space where people are able to be vulnerable and start talking about these experiences, and it often starts with leaders who can model that, I think. And like you said, we all are walking around with stuff, but creating a space where leaders are also able to process through some of these in helpful ways, and not all of a sudden all this stuff is out there. But there's ways to do it that I think
certainly
are really helpful. And John Gorder said, how do we approach children exhibiting bad behaviors, and how do we approach their parents?
Yeah, that's tough. We talk a lot about in helping the stages of change. And I think that's actually pretty helpful in helping people. If you Google it, stages of change, you'll get a good PDF on that. But you know, sometimes people are ready to get help and some people are not. And I think we always want people to get well. And so we say, come with me, I want to help you. But really, if they're not in a place of readiness to get well or to change, then our efforts are going to probably be pretty ineffective. And people come to that place of decision making or determination about wanting to change. They say when the pain of staying the same is greater than the pain of changing, right? So they have to kind of feel the weight of what's going on. And sometimes that means us setting boundaries with them, because then they're forced to have to think about their own junk, you know? And sometimes that means we just have to prayerfully wait that they'll hit their wall. And that's really hard to watch too. I know, you know, especially with kids, you know, I've had kids that we've worked with, and you know, they're headed straight to the juvenile justice system. And I remember praying with a parent that God would just, first of all, rescue them from that. But if he didn't, that they would hit it and land in a place where they someday could put their feet back under them, you know? And I think sometimes as the church, that's the role we're in, is sometimes we pray them through it, not just away from it. Do you know what I mean? So my first thought would be a stage of readiness. We'd have to, you know, assess if they're ready, both the child and the parent. Because if they don't want your help, they're not going to, if they don't think it's a problem, they're not going to care, you know, for your advice. And so I'd ask that question, you know, what would have to happen for you to feel like this was a problem, you know, like, and so we try to spend some time creating awareness. Like, I'm noticing that he's getting in trouble, or he or she's getting in trouble, that you're really stressed about this, that it's weighing you down, you know, tell me more about that. And maybe they'll be like, you know what, this is hard. I am sick of this. And then the process of coming alongside really comes into play, which, you know, then I would say get professionals involved and connect them to resources depending on the intensity of their behavior. But I don't know where they're at in that stage, John, or if you want to expand more on that. But
no, that's adequate. Thank you, Tara. That's good.
Yeah, you're welcome.
In a couple of minutes, we're going to be breaking up into smaller groups to talk a little bit more. But there are a few other questions here. I'm wondering, there's a question from Jeff Vanderhooft, and it's a little bit more science-y, but he says, can you talk about what happens when the frontal lobe won't engage because of trauma? You just muted yourself.
Usually I can't answer sciencey questions, but I think I can do this one. So if the frontal lobe won't engage, they're going to act very, very emotional, erratic, and probably unpredictable. Their emotion, there's going to be a lot of big, you know, visible emotions, but there's also going to be a lot of physiological things going on in their body, increased heart rate. Some of them will sweat. Some of them will, you know, tense up. I remember when I used to work with teenage boys, they would just go like this and their bodies just respond because they're stuck in that fight or flight kind of, you know, so to speak. So if they're not able to use that good sound thinking, you'll see big emotions. But, you know, some people internalize their emotions well. And then it'll look like depression or anxiety that sometimes you'll get to see and sometimes you won't. You know, just depending on the maturity of their ability. Like young kids are really bad at disguising it, so you'll often see big behaviors, but adults get better at hiding, and so then it manifests themselves through, you know, depression, anxiety, things like that start to interfere with their day-to-day. So does that make sense, or does that answer your question?
There's some experiences to that I've had. One, working at Pine Rest and working with you know, working on a unit, you open up a door and a kid's standing right behind it waiting for you to do the room check. Very antisocial. Then the other one is there's a young gentleman in our state who's in prison, probably for the rest of his life, who shot his dad, and I did the funeral. But he was adopted at 9 years old. The parents had adopted a girl that, I mean, they adopted her 7 or 8, and it was just boom, she loved it. Frontal lobe opened up, and she just, you know, sucked up any love she could get from anybody, and just loved being adopted. The boy they adopted he was not going to engage, period. I can't remember what it's called, but failure to bond or something.
Thrive, and probably had attachment issues, right?
Yeah.
Disruption and attachment.
And so I have encountered it, I've seen it, and when I have, it's been really, really scary. It has frightened the ever living daylights out of me.
Yeah. And you're talking about a very special group. That's a very high risk group and a very vulnerable group. There's some resources, and I could talk to you for a long time about that, because I still work through how to best help those families too. But
Okay.
On that resource page, I've shared Texas Christian University's Dr. Karen Purvis came out with she's now since passed away, but they named their Center for Child Development after her. It's called Trust-Based Relational Interventions. And that's basically, it's really based on neuroscience about and she spent her whole life serving kids. She called them kids from hard places. So, kids that have been adopted or foster care, things like that. And so they have an intervention on there and they share a lot of YouTube videos and resources about what that looks like to work with those, to talk to those kids, to understand their behavior. You might like that resource that's on that page. But that's hard stuff. I know. Yeah. And then that young boy that's incarcerated. I mean, that's a passion of mine too. Like, yeah, his obviously wasn't using his good solid thinking. I mean, he wasn't thinking, oh, if I shoot this person, I will have to, they're just, it's all emotion. It's all fear. It's all, in that moment. And then when that's why kids can say they're sorry later, right? When they calm down and then they sit and they say they're sorry. That's why we say we're sorry too. If I'm fighting with my husband, I go a little ways. I'm sorry. That was really dumb. Right. But when we're in the moment, we're just not thinking well. So, but we can talk later too about that. I know Mr. Vanderhoof's daughter, she's in our program. So
my daughter speaks highly of you.
Oh, good. I didn't get a lot of time with her with baby and COVID, but I'll get more time with her too. So good.
Okay. We had a few other questions, but we want to provide some time for you all to connect as well. And so we're going to jump into the breakout rooms, and then we're going to come back for a few concluding thoughts at around 1 p.m. Here we go. Do the break. I'm assigning 24 participants into 2 rooms. So, and it's just done randomly. So here it goes.
All right, welcome back. As people are I think everyone's back now. Thank you so much again, Tara. I think there's a way to clap on Zoom, but I still don't know how to do that. Someday I'll figure that out. Anyway, we really appreciated this. This led to some great discussion in our, some people have figured it out. A great discussion, and just so safe space for people, and being curious when you see people not saying what's wrong with you, but what happened instead. And also how understanding what happens in the brain could really help reduce that stigma and create a safer space. Someone said we need to break through the wall of silence and shame that's keeping us from connecting in times when we need connecting. So again, thank you so much. Please, we'd love someone to write a little article for the network about how meaningful and great this was. So if you want to do that, just send me an email, or else we may be in touch with 1 or 2 of you and say, would you be willing to write a couple paragraphs? It's really pretty easy. We'd love to have that feedback. And for other people too, we will be posting this webinar for people to look at later. So that'll be great. And then next month, we have another webinar coming up with Boz Chavidian. Will be joining us he's the founder of Grace, Godly Response to Abuse in Christian Environments. So we would love to have you join us next month as well. And thank you all for coming. We appreciate it. And we appreciate your questions and comments. Thanks. Any last word, Tara?
No, just thanks for listening, and thanks for caring about, some of these vulnerable people that God really, really cares deeply about too.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks so much. All right. See you next month, hopefully. Bye-bye.
Farewell, everyone.